Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to quite a few new members of our Patreon family. Brian, Soren, Karen, Cynthia, Emily, Nick, Hannah, another Nick, Alice, Catherine, and Stephen. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us cover the costs of recording, production, and distribution while remaining ad-free and relaxed for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're relaxing with the second part of a book that more than a few of you have requested more from. Spices, Their Histories. Valuable Information for Grocers. Written by Robert O. Fielding. Copyrighted in 1910 by the Trade Register Incorporated of Seattle, Washington. Let's pick up right where we left off with a discussion of ginger. Let's begin. Ginger, used as a spice by the early Greeks and Romans, plant a native of Asia and grew wild in Mexico and Africa. As a spice, ginger was used among the early Greeks and Romans, who appear to have received it by way of the Red Sea, inasmuch as they considered it to be a production of southern Arabia. In the list of imports from the Red Sea into Alexandria, which in the 2nd century of our era were then liable to the Roman fiscal duty, ginger occurs among other Indian spices. It appears in the tariff of duties levied at Acre in Palestine about 1173, in that of Barcelona in 1221, Marseille in 1228, and Paris 1296. It was known in England before the Norman Conquest, being frequently named in the Anglo-Saxon leech books of the 11th century, as well as in the Welsh Physicians of Mythve. During the 13th and 14th centuries, it was, next to pepper, the commonest of spices, costing on an average 1 shilling 7 per pound, or about the price of a sheep. 3 kinds of ginger were known to Italian merchants about the 14th century. 1. Baledi or Baladi, an Arabic name which applied to ginger would signify country, wild, and denotes common ginger. 2. Columbonio, which refers to Columbono, Colam or Quilon, a port in Travanore, frequently referred to in the Middle Ages. 3. Mekino, which denotes brought from or by way of Mecca. Marco Polo saw it in India and China 1230 to 1239. John of Montecorvino, a missionary friar, who visited India in 1290, gives a description of the plant and refers to the root being dug up and transplanted. Niccolo de Conti, a Venetian merchant, early in the 15th century, describes the plant and a collection of roots he saw in India. The Venetians received it by way of Egypt, and superior kinds from India overland by the Black Sea. Ginger was introduced into America by Francisco de Mondoca, who took it from the East Indies to New Spain. It was shipped for commercial purposes from the islands of Santo Domingo in 1585 and from Barbados in 1654. Ginger is the dried, nutty, fibrous rhizomes or tubers, races or hands as they are called, from their irregular palmate form, of the ginger plant, Zingiber officinale, the real roots being the thin fibers that branch off from the rhizomes. The plant is a native of Asia, but also found growing wild in Mexico and East Africa. It is a reed-like biennial plant, not unlike the iris or flag in appearance. The leaves are long, similar to those of maize, growing alternate on a stem 3 to 4 feet high. The flowers are borne on a separate stem 6 to 12 inches high. They are yellow or blue according to the quality of the soil in which they have been grown. The plant which produces the yellow flower and best ginger is grown on rich, deep, virgin soil. The other comes from poorer ground. Ginger is propagated by pieces of the rhizome being planted in March. The flowers appear about September, after they have withered and seeded. The roots are dug up about January. When left too long in the ground, the rhizomes become very fibrous. If taken up too soon, they are tender and succulent, so much so that they cannot be made sufficiently dry to render them fit for export in the usual commercial form. They are therefore preserved in sugar. The rhizomes, besides being classed as yellow or blue, are also divided into plant, being the rhizomes from plants of the same season's growth, and ratoon, which are rhizomes left in the ground from the previous harvest. Ginger is known in commerce in 2 distinct forms, termed respectively as coated or uncoated ginger, as having or wanting the epidermis. For the coated ginger, the races of hands, after being dug up, are thoroughly washed to free them from all the adhering earth. They are then laid on a canvas or cement floor outdoors to dry by the heat of the sun. At night they are taken indoors. It takes from 6 to 8 days to thoroughly dry them. Then they are ready for shipment. In damp weather they are artificially dried by an evaporator. In this form, ginger presents a brown, more or less wrinkled or straighted surface, and when broken up, shows a dark brownish fracture, hard and sometimes horny and resinous. For the uncoated ginger, the fresh dug rhizomes, after being washed, are soaked in water for some time and then peeled or scraped, a most delicate operation requiring the hand of an expert. Owing to the peculiar formation of the races, no machine has yet been invented that will do the work satisfactorily. The outer rind or skin is deftly taken off by means of a common knife, so as not to injure the inner root, as a loss of the pungent volatile oil to which ginger owes its value would follow and thus impair its commercial worth. After being peeled, the races are soaked in water overnight. In the morning they are again washed, cleaned, and weighed, and then dried in the same manner as coated ginger. It requires 3 pounds of green root to make 1 pound of dry root. The purer the water, the whiter the ginger. Sometimes lime juice is added to the wash water, which gives a whiter root, but as lime juice contains sugar, it prevents thorough drying and mildew follows. Ginger is often subjected to a system of bleaching, or by immersion for a short time in a solution of chlorinated lime. The whitewashed appearance which much of the ginger has is due to the fact of its being washed in whiting or even coated with sulfate of lime. Uncoated ginger varies from single joints an inch or less to flattish, irregularly branched pieces of several joints, the races of hands, and from 3 to 4 inches long. Each race has a depression on the summit, showing the former attachment of a leafy stem. The color, when not whitewashed, is a pale buff. It is somewhat rough, breaking with a short, mealy fracture, and presenting on the surface of the broken parts numerous short or bristly fibers. The best ginger grown comes from Jamaica. It is of a superior strength, fine flavor, and a light, handsome color. A peculiar trade custom prevails in Jamaica with regard to ginger, which is not sold by weight or measure, but by the heap, and the size of the heap governs the price, and is an indication to a certain extent of the quality and quantity of the crop. If the heap is small, the price is high. If the heap is large, then the price is lower. If the races or hands are finely shaped and large, there are fewer in the heap. If small, dark, and mealy, the heap is made larger. The next best quality is Borneo or Cochin Ginger, which closely resembles in appearance the Jamaica. It is not, however, so carefully prepared. African ginger, also termed Bombay or Calcutta from the ports of shipment, is darker in color, has a coarser appearance, a harsher flavor, and inferior aroma to either of the above, but contains a greater amount of oleoresin than they do and is very pungent. It is largely used for making ginger beer, essences, extracts, etc. Leaf ginger is ginger that has been sliced into thin flakes. Green ginger root is that which has not undergone any process of cleaning beyond freeing it from the earth adhering. Imported in casks, it is used by winemakers, preservers, etc. Spent ginger is whole ginger that has once been used, then fixed up to resemble good ginger and sold whole or ground. It does not possess a single one of the valuable properties of genuine ginger. China ginger is not imported in a dried state, the rhizomes being too tender and succulent to thoroughly dry for export. It is preserved or candied. For preserving, the rhizomes are first scalded, then washed in cold water and peeled, then boiled in pans for 2 or 3 hours. then transferred to copper pans and boiled for 2 hours in a mixture of sugar and water, just sufficient water to cover the roots, 5 pounds of sugar to 10 pounds of ginger, the roots having been pierced with a sharp instrument to enable the sugar to soak into them. After boiling, the ginger is put into large jars and stands for several days, when it is again boiled in sugar and water in the same quantities. After it has become cold, it is packed in jars or tins for export. To crystallize, the same process is gone through, only in the final boiling, it is boiled until the sugar become dry. The Chinese season for preserving ginger is from July to October. It is nearly all prepared in Canton and Hong Kong. A kind known as Nung Mai Kunik is preserved in Swaton from Alpina galanga, but it is not like the Canton or Hankou ginger and is only made for native consumption, to be used medicinally or for cooking. Some of it goes to the Straits settlement, but none to Hong Kong. Jamaica preserved ginger is mostly put up in glass bottles. The uses of ginger are too well known to need repeating. Mustard, well known to the ancients, but more in a medicinal way. How cultivated and prepared for commercial uses. Mustard was well known to the ancients, but more in a medicinal way than dietetic. From an edict of Diocletian, 30 AD, in which it is mentioned along with alimentary substances, we must suppose it was then regarded as a condiment, at least in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, mustard was a valued accompaniment to food, especially with the salted meats, which constituted a large portion of the diet of our ancestors during the winter. In the Welsh Methegan Mithre of the 13th century, a paragraph is devoted to the virtues of mustard. In household accounts of the 13th and 14th centuries, mustard is of constant occurrence. It was then cultivated in England, but not extensively. The price of the seed between 1285 and 1340 varied from 1 shilling 3 to 6 shillings 8 per quarter, or 21 pounds. But between 1347 and 1376, it was as high as 15 shillings and 16 shillings. In the accounts of the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, 800 AD, mustard is specially mentioned as a regular part of the revenue of the convent lands. The essential oil of mustard was first noticed in 1660 by Nicolas Lefebvre, and more distinctly in 1732 by Boerharoux. The word mustard comes from the Italian murtard, which is derived from the Latin mustum, unfermented grape juice, with which the Italians formerly mixed ground mustard. The Athenians called it napi, while the Hellenistic name was sinapi, whence the Latin sinapi or sinapis, from which is derived the German word Senf. Hippocrates used mustard in medicine under the name of Vanuit. The dark seed which comes from Trieste, Austria, is called Trieste mustard. What is called French mustard, German mustard, etc., is made of the dressings mixed with vinegar, garlic, and other spices, and flavoring musterial. The form in which table mustard is now sold dates from 1720, about which time a Mrs. Clements of Durham, England, hit on the idea of grinding the seed in a mill and sifting the flour from the husk. This bright yellow farina rapidly attained wide popularity. The fame of Durham mustard was spread far and wide, Mrs. Clements traveling to London and principal cities twice a year, taking orders. There are two species of mustard plants from which ground mustard is made: the Sinapes alba, white or yellow mustard, and Sinapes nigra, brown or black mustard. They are annual herbs 3 to 6 feet high, with lyriate leaves, yellow flowers, and slender pods, from 1 to 4 inches long, containing a single row of roundish seeds. One of the peculiarities incident to the cultivation of mustard is the fact that 2 crops of mustard cannot be raised on the same ground in succession. Another variety is Sinapes arvenis, or wild mustard, called charlock and used for adulterating. The Sarepta, the black seed of the Sinapes juntia from the East Indies, is used for the same purpose. Sarepta is called from a city of that name in Russia, in the government of Saratov. The brown or black variety is sown in January, and the white or yellow in March, the seed being sown broadcast and harvested in August. A reaper is used, cutting the stalks and throwing them in bunches, where they are left to cure until October. They are now thoroughly dry and are taken to a convenient place, spread out upon sheets of canvas, and rolled with a heavy roller. The stalks and empty pods are then raked off, and the chaff and seeds remaining are run through a fanning machine, after which process they are ready to sack and market. There are 2 processes in use in making ground mustard. In the first, the seeds, white or black or mixed, are ground to powder and then put through an elaborate course of siftings. The product left after the first sifting is called dressings, and that which passes through is pure mustard flour. This mustard flour is again run through a finer sieve, and so on until the required fineness is obtained. From the dressings left after the different sievings, the essential oil of mustard is expressed. In the other method, the oil is first extracted from the seeds by hydraulic pressure, which leaves a sort of cake. This cake is then broken up and pounded in a mortar. It is then sifted, that going through the sieve being a kind of bolted mustard flour. The remaining bran is then mixed with an equal quantity of wheat flour, 1% of cayenne, and sufficient turmeric to give the proper color. This is pounded and treated as before, the process being continued until there is no bran left. Then all the different siftings are mixed together, giving a mixture of about equal proportions of mustard and wheat flour, with the cayenne and turmeric added in proper quantities. The peculiar pungency and odor to which mustard owes much of its value are due to an essential oil developed by the action of water on 2 chemical substances contained in black mustard seed, one called sinigrin and the other myrosin. The latter substance in the presence of water acts as a sort of ferment on the sinigrin, and it is worthy of remark that this reaction does not take place in the presence of boiling water, and therefore it is not proper to use very hot water in the preparation of mustard. cold water only should be used. White mustard seed contains in the place of sinigrin a peculiar acrid substance called sinalbin, and also a trace of myrosin. Therefore it possesses very little pungency, and it produces a larger percentage of flour than the black. The proper blending of these two seeds is necessary to the production of the best mustard, as the white has the peculiar ferment within it, which develops to the highest degree the flavor of the black. The reason for mixing wheat flour, rice flour, or other farina with pure mustard flour is that owing to the large amount of oil contained in the latter, it will not keep long, but turns rancid, ferments, and cakes. The added farinas, by absorbing a portion of the oil, retard fermentation, decomposition, and rancidity. They should not be looked upon as adulterants unless added in too great quantities, and the price of the mustard should be in proportion to the added absorbents. A mean form of adulteration is to mix gypsum and chrome yellow with the ground mustard seed. If upon the addition of a small quantity of iodine to ground mustard it turns blue, it shows that starch is present. The ammonia test will show the presence of turmeric. Every manufacturer has his own particular formula, and consequently there are many different qualities, both in the pure mustard and the compounds. One is composed of 37% brown and 50% white mustard flour, 10% of rice flour, 3% of black pepper, a little chili pepper, and ginger. Pure mustard oil as pressed from the seed is not pungent and will not blister unless mixed with water. The English mustard seed is the best in the world. Of this class, 4,995,800 pounds of seed and 1,307,202 pounds of flour were imported during the year 1908. Mustard seed and flour from Italy is known as Trieste. In the Lompo Valley, California, some 2,500 acres are under mustard cultivation, and a small quantity is also grown in Kentucky. The uses of mustard are too well known to need recapitulation. DSF means double superfine. Nutmeg and mace. Where the nutmeg tree grows, yield of nuts and mace, and how prepared for the market. Uses in commerce. The nutmeg tree, known to botanists as Myristica frangens, or sweet-smelling, is a native of the Malay archipelago. The tree, which in the Banda Isles grows to the height of 50 to 60 feet, and in the straits from 30 to 40 feet, resembles the pear tree in the shape of its leaves and fruit. Its flowers are like those of the lily of the valley in form and size, but are pale yellow and exceedingly fragrant. There are male and female flowers, the nutmegs being obtained from the latter. It is only when the tree is about 6 or 8 years old that the female tree can be distinguished from the male, and of the latter, only a few are allowed to remain for fertilizing purposes, the rest being cut down. The nutmeg tree continues to yield from 70 to 80 years after reaching maturity, which takes place at 8 years. Each tree, on an average, will produce 10 pounds of nutmegs and 1½ pounds of mace annually. The fruit is yellowish, an edible drupe, about the size of a peach. It splits into halves when at maturity, about 9 months from the time of blossoming, exposing a single seed with a thin, hard shell, surrounded by a fibrous substance of a crimson color, which, when dried and shelled, becomes the nutmeg. The young drupes, when young and tender, are often preserved like jam, and are considered the most aromatic and delicious of conserves. Although the nutmeg tree has ripe fruit upon it at all seasons, there are 3 principal periods of harvesting. July, when the fruit is most abundant, though it yields thin mace. November, when the mace is thicker, though the nutmegs are smaller. And March, when both mace and nutmegs reach their greatest perfection. But as this season is dry, the production is not great. The usual method of gathering in the straits is to collect the ripe nuts that have fallen on the ground. In the Banda Islands, the fruits are gathered in small, neatly made, oval bamboo baskets, holding about 3 fruit at the end of a long bamboo stick which prevents bruising, the baskets being opened for about half their length on one side, and furnished with 2 small prongs projecting from the top, by which the fruit stalk is broken, the fruit falling into the basket. After the pulp, which is about 1/2 inch thick, whitish in color, and tough like candied peel, has been removed, the mace is stripped off by hand. The shell of the fruit is very hard and cannot be broken without injury to the kernel. To overcome this, they are put into receptacles with fine mesh bottoms and dried over a slow fire, being turned from time to time until the kernel rattles freely in the shell, a process which takes about 6 or 8 weeks. This also kills any weevil which may be at work in them. They are then carefully cracked by placing them on a sort of drum head made of raw hide and striking them with a board or mallet, when the shells fly off into pieces. Great caution is needed in shelling, for if too hard a blow be struck, it makes a black spot on the nutmeg, which affects its value considerably. After being steeped in salt water several times and again dried, they are sorted according to size and soundness. 130 to 140 to the pound are the lowest priced, 75 to 80 the highest, and larger nuts are sold at special prices. The sorting is done by hand, and nothing but sound, perfect nuts are supposed to be shipped. The broken and wormy ones are used in manufacturing nutmeg butter, or as it is commonly but erroneously called, mace oil. The nuts are now limed. There are 2 methods of liming in vogue, the dry and the wet. In the dry process, the nuts have dry lime powder rubbed over them, either by hand or shaking in barrels. In the wet process, the nuts are put into newly slaked lime and then spread out to dry, or they are dipped into a kind of lime pickle thick as syrup, made of calcined shells and salt water. After being covered with this mixture, they are dried. The process of liming originated with the Dutch, with a view to preventing the germinating of the seed, for which purpose they were formerly immersed for 3 months in milk of lime. Again, it is claimed that liming preserves the nuts against the attacks of maggots and a particular kind of beetle by stopping up their breathing and chewing apparatus. A preference is still manifested for limed nutmegs. As nutmegs are now seldom shipped by sailing vessels but by steamers, thus saving the long time voyage, there is no reason why they should not come unlimed, and then the differences in their natural complexions and range of variations would become familiar and easily recognized. The liming process hides many imperfect or corky nuts. Nuts which have been riddled with wormholes are stopped with a paste made of flour, oil, and nutmeg powder, and then mixed with the sound ones. Occasionally, this paste is molded into false nutmegs. Besides this, nutmegs are frequently robbed of part of their essential oil by distillation in alcohol, a process called sweating, and yet sold as entire nuts. A small quantity of boracic acid will accomplish the same purpose as lime, and Paris white and barytes will serve to mask the identity as well as the defects. A good nutmeg should have no wormholes, be full of oil, and cut firm like a piece of wood, and if a pin is thrust into one, the oil should ooze out on its being withdrawn. The Penang nutmegs, which are generally not limed, are considered the best, although some prefer the Banda or Batavia, and after these the Singapore. There is also a demand for an elliptical-shaped nutmeg of rank flavor, first called long nutmegs, but now known as Macassars. Another kind of nutmeg from New Guinea, and known in Germany as horse nutmeg, is from the species Myristica argentea. It is of a long and narrow shape. In these, the areolas or mace furrows are less marked, and their odor is not so delicate as that of the true nutmeg. There are many kinds of wild or inferior nutmegs, such as American Jamaica or Calabash nutmeg, Myristica monodora, of the custard apple family, bearing a large pulpy fruit containing aromatic seeds. Brazilian nutmeg, Cryptocarya moscata, a tree of the laurel family, produces nutmegs of an inferior quality. The nut is longer than the true species and is sold under the name of long nutmeg. California nutmeg, a tree of the pine family, called also stinking nutmeg or stinking yew, from the disagreeable odor of the leaves and wood when bruised and burned, and yielding a fruit resembling true nutmegs. Clove nutmeg, a Madagascar tree of the laurel family, the fruit a pungent kernel resembling the true nutmeg and used as a spice. Peruvian nutmeg, a large tree of the Monimiid family, yielding an aromatic fruit. From Borneo, a wild soapy nutmeg and mace are often palmed off as the true kinds. There is also the Santa Fe nutmeg, Matoba from Colombia, South America, and Akaway nutmeg, a spice grown in Guyana, the fruit of Acrodiclidum camard. Another species, Sebifera, is a common tree in the forests of Guyana, North Brazil, and up into Panama. It is utilized principally for the oil extracted from the nuts, obtained by macerating them in water, the oil rising to the surface, and as it cools skimmed off. and akui nutmegs, used mainly as a cure for diarrhea and colic. All these, while resembling somewhat the true nutmegs and sometimes foisted on dealers, are of very little real value. Mace. When the mace, a bright red membranous substance, is removed from the nut, it is pressed flat between blocks of wood and left to dry until it has acquired the right color. The preparation of mace for the market requires experience rather than technical knowledge. If packed too green, it is liable to mold and is subject to attacks from insects, which render it valueless in commerce. On the other hand, if it becomes too dry, it loses its vitality and also crumbles into powder when packed. Packers frequently sprinkle the mace with salt water, which makes it more pliable and at the same time prevents attacks from insects. We may here state that nutmegs are divided into two varieties: the green, which are long and in which the mace only partially covers the nut, is darker in color and inferior in flavor and aroma, and the royal, which furnishes the finest and best mace, firm, thick, flexible, and oily, and entirely envelops the nut. As with the nutmeg, mace is sometimes deprived of its essential oil and mixed with wild mace or other flavorless matter. Myristica malabarica, known under the name of Bombay mace, used to adulterate the true powdered mace, is much larger and more cylindrical than the aryllus of the true nutmeg, and has several flaps united at the apex, forming a conical structure. Products: candied nutmeg and mace, nutmeg fruits in vinegar or salt, preserved nutmeg fruits, and nutmeg or mace essence made from the essential oil of nutmegs, not mace, and rectified spirits. An essence of mace is also made from 6 ounces mace and 2 pints cologne spirit, macerated for a couple of weeks, expressed and filtered through paper. Nutmeg butter, butter of nutmeg or mace, concrete oil of nutmeg or expressed oil of mace, as it is variously called, is obtained by subjecting the nutmeg or mace to a great heat and then squeezing or pressing it in heavy presses. The substance is of a green color, of the consistency of tallow, and of a pleasant smell. A pound of nutmegs will make 3 ounces of this oil, but a transparent volatile oil is obtained by distillation. It evaporates rapidly on exposure to air. When cold, it becomes somewhat spongy and has a marbled or mottled appearance. It becomes hard with age and is exported in small bricks, 10 inches by 2 1/2 inches, wrapped in palm leaves. It is known under several names, as nutmeg butter, balsam of nutmeg, concrete oil, or the mace oil of commerce, and as Banda soap, sometimes made from the distilled nutmeg leaves, counterfeited by using a foreign fatty substance as palm oil, nut, wax, and animal fat, boiled with powdered nutmeg and flavored with sassafras, which gives it the right color and flavor. Uses: nutmegs, besides their use as a spice or condiment, are used to relieve sleeplessness when opium fails and chloral is not advisable. For diarrhea, half a dram in milk is an effective cure. Butter of mace is used as a liniment and embrocation for rheumatism, and is also a favorite medicine for low stages of fever with Hindu doctors. For ground nutmeg, all the faulty, broken, moldy, worm-eaten, and wild nutmegs are often used. A little of the history of mace and nutmegs. It has generally been believed that neither the nutmeg or mace were known to the ancients. Nutmegs and mace were imported from India at an early date by the Arabians, and thus passed into Western countries. Masudi, who appears to have visited England in 916 to 920 AD, pointed out that the nutmeg, like cloves, areca nut, and sandalwood, were a product of the eastern isles of the Indian archipelago. The Arabian geographer Idrisi, who wrote in the middle of the 12th century, mentions both nutmeg and mace as articles of import into Aden. They are also among the articles on which duty was levied at Acre in 1180. About a century later, another Arabian author, Kozwim, expressly named the Moluccas as the native country of the spices under notice. One of the earliest references to them in Europe occurs in a poem about 1195 by Petrus de Bulow, describing the entry into Rome of the Emperor Henry VI, previous to his coronation in 1191. By the end of the 12th century, both nutmeg and mace were found in northern Europe, even in Denmark, as may be inferred from the allusions to them in the writings of Harpistring. In England, mace, though well known, was a very costly article, its value between 1284 and 1377 being about 4 shillings 7 pence per pound, while the average price of a sheep during the same period was about 1 shilling 5 pence, and of a cow 9 shillings 5 pence. It was also dear in France, for when the will of Jeanne d'Evreux, Queen of France, in 1372, 6 ounces of mace were appraised at the rate of 8 shillings 3 pence per pound. In the middle of the 18th century, the Dutch, with the object of monopolizing the trade in nutmegs, destroyed all the trees in all the Moluccas Islands except Banda. Nature did not, however, sympathize with such meanness. The nutmeg pigeon, found in all the Indian islands, did for the world what the Dutch had determined should not be done, carried the nuts which are their food into all the surrounding countries, and trees grew again, and the world had the benefit. In order to keep up the price, the surplus stock was burned up each year by certain unscrupulous men, as is proposed to do at the present day with the surplus stock of Brazilian coffee. In 1760, they burned at Amsterdam 3 such immense piles of nutmegs and cloves that one writer says, each of which was as big as a church. This account of nutmeg would not be complete without Connecticut nutmegs. Some 90 years ago, Frederick Ockham startled England with his book, Adulteration of Food and Culinary Poison, and a sort of pure food hysteria passed through the country, similar to that caused by the boric acid investigation here. But he was eclipsed by a person who declared that the makers of wooden shoe pegs in Connecticut were making oats and nutmegs from the discarded wood of sawmills. He asserted they were not only made, but used as food throughout the country. Thus was Connecticut christened the Nutmeg State, a name which it has retained even unto this day. And with that curious anecdote, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Spices, Their Histories, which once again has proved far more interesting than I expected. I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com, or catch me on Twitter at boringbookspod. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. A number of you have written in with suggestions and requests, and it's quite a long list, but I promise I'm keeping track and will eventually get to you all. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.